So over the next hour, we're going to hear two brief inputs from our two main speakers today, and then open up the room to questions from you all. So feel free to, as we're going through, just put those in the chat per normal. And I'll do my best to keep track of those and then get through as many as possible at the end. And we're also open to hearing from you guys live. So again, once we get to the Q&A section, if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud, feel free to use the hand raise function. After the official end of this hour, so at 6 p.m. German time, noon Eastern time, we're going to open up the space for more questions that are specifically about the fellowship application process for TECE. So I would suggest just holding those questions to the end. I'll try to collect them if they come in, but again, that'll be time dedicated to that. If you don't want to stay for that portion, you're free to go. Not that you're captive here anyway on Zoom, but that'll be set aside specifically for that portion. And before we especially launch into the content, I also wanted to give folks the chance to introduce themselves. We would love to know who is in the room with us today. So in the chat section, if you'll just put in there where you're zooming in from today, you can be as creative with that as you want. And then number two, reflect a bit, maybe the first thing that comes to your mind on an experience that helped shape your civic or political identity. I know I've spent quite a bit of time reflecting on that myself, and I think it kind of helps sets the tone for rethinking what actually is civic learning. Okay, and as folks are doing that introduction in the chat, I want to introduce my colleague, Georg Pirke. He is responsible for international education for democratic citizenship and human rights education at ADB. And he also chairs the European Democracy and Human Rights Education, or DARE network. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about this new project.
Okay, thank you very much, Katja, and a warm welcome from my side here from Berlin. I have to apologize for speaking bad Euro English. So we have to be aware that some of us people are kind of native speakers, some not. So keep in mind, no one speaks really fast. Sometimes people speak too fast, so it's all fine. TECE has already started a few days ago, and Katja and me, we are very excited and very happy that this is the first event where we try to build a community and bring people together from both countries, from the US and from Germany. Our big aim and ambition is to realize this year and start of next year, together with Peter Levine, an exchange program with 10 and 10 people from the US and Germany who are interested in this field of kind of a mutual dialogue and of projects development in the civic education field. These events we do right now in the digital sphere are a bit also community building, a bit kind of finding where the topics are and finding what issues we are important, kind of developing for us also a bit of an idea where we will set the focus later on through this whole year of work we have ahead of us. And we are very happy to have at the moment, I think almost 50 people here in this meeting, probably even more in other lectures or in other kind of online events we are going to hold. And today is more or less kind of, with this kickoff, is a bit of the idea to have some views and some, let's say, landmarks from two persons who have an field overview and who have, let's say, also a long time experience kind of accompanying that field, looking at field, working in that field, which is Peter Levine and Bettina Heinrich, and both of them, one in Boston, one in Berlin, Ludwigsburg as well, will kind of present us their views, and other later on we can go on and develop a bit kind of a discussion or see where we have common interests or where we have specific questions and go on. Okay, Katja, thank you. So.
Okay. Two more small things that I wanted to point out. We have two other upcoming events that are maybe interesting to you all. One is it's May 3rd, so a little less than 2 weeks from now. And we're going to be talking about with three researchers, actually youth researchers, on who actually are young people in Germany and the US. And so I'll put a link in the chat in a moment. You guys are of course, more than welcome to join us for that conversation. And then there's another event that's actually not hosted by TECE, but a partner organization that might be interesting. It's a bar camp that's online, or an unconference as it's often sometimes known as. That's on May 5th, and it's open actually for the first time to international audience. So I will also put that there. Okay, so turning to our brilliant speakers that we have wrestled up for today. First, I want to introduce Dr. Peter Levine, who I mentioned already has been a great partner for us with TECE so far in the journey. And he is the Associate Dean and Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Tufts University's Tisch College of Civic Life. He was trained as a political philosopher and has spent most of his career conducting applied empirical research and organizing professional efforts related to civic life in the US, including over 20 years of work on civic education. He's the author of numerous books on civic life and even a fiction novel, actually, and is the former director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or CIRCLE. And he's a very prolific blogger. I think actually, as a fun fact, I believe there was a point where you had a streak of posting every day, which as someone who attempted a blog, I can say is quite impressive. So we will turn it over to you first, Peter. Thanks again so much for being here.
Thanks, Katja, and thanks to both Katja and Georg for organizing this and really for the vision. And the blogging streak was probably obsessive compulsive rather than anything else. But I'm delighted to be here today, and actually a number of really good friends are on the call. So hi to my friends in both continents. But also I'm really excited about meeting new people. So I will present some slides. We're both going to do that. But I'm going to be disciplined about probably not presenting all of them, and just really, a sense, giving a taste of and opening up some conversation. And I hope this is okay. I took a sort of historical. So my job is to talk about civic education in the United States so that we can compare and contrast. And I took a historical perspective. So I don't know if that was the best thing to do, but I did it. So I have some pictures of people on a few slides. So I wanted to trace two traditions that seem influential in the US. And one is the tradition that Alexis de Tocqueville observed when he visited the United States in 1831. And I just tried to pronounce his name in the French accent as best I could, but I will say for the Germans, he wrote, the book Democracy in America, which is so important to our self-conception in the US that we tend to have borrowed him. And actually people call him Alexis de Tocqueville just like that, because we think of him as an American, but he was, of course, a French aristocrat. And, the basic claim that I want to make there is he thought that democracy worked in the US in 1831 because we had a tradition of voluntary association at the local level. So we joined groups and formed groups. And it's there that we learned the mechanics and the arts of governance. As he called the association the mother art of democracy, and that this was sort of the reason that the system worked. So it's a tradition because it says that that voluntary association among adults, citizens, is the way to learn the arts and sciences of association on which democracy depends. And before proceeding beyond that, I want to say I'm not romanticizing the United States in 1831. 15% of the population was enslaved, and the frontier was a battleground where white people were killing indigenous people. But so I'm not saying things were very good in America in 1831, but I think there was truth to the description that Americans associated at a high rate and learned the arts of association there. So the parallel tradition is represented by Horace Mann from this state of Massachusetts, who is associated, he's the sort of name you put on the movement to universalize schooling in the United States. So he's the person who advocated for universal schooling, and Massachusetts became one of the first jurisdictions in the world to try to educate everyone in schools. And by the way, very strongly influenced by Prussia, by efforts in Prussia, which he had visited. And this is this is typical of many social reformers in the 19th century in the United States, that they made trips to Prussia. But anyway, the key point is that in trying to build a system of education for everyone, schooling for everyone, he was in fact trying to serve democratic aims. So the goal was to prepare one for service on juries and for voting, for democracy, not anything else. For example, not economic improvement. The style of education wouldn't appeal to me. It was pretty moralistic and explicitly Christian, and otherwise not what I would vote for. But it was democratic in inspiration. So the third person on this slide is John Dewey, perhaps the most influential American thinker, I would say, certainly the most influential philosopher of education. I shouldn't be talking about him because in this company, because among others, Sarah Stitzline, who's on the call, is actually an expert on Dewey, and I'm not. But I wanted to say, in many ways, he reflects both of those two traditions because he sees learning for democracy as a process that should occur in practice. That is, it's by experiencing democracy that we should become good little d Democrats, by participating. So that's Tocquevillian. But on the other hand, he also inherited a world in which there were schools, and he saw the school as a place where you could learn democracy. And not only children, but that adult participation in schools should be a form of education for the adults. So John Dewey's expecting you to learn to be a Democrat, little d Democrat, in school, but by experience. And so in contrast to Horace Mann, he doesn't want the teacher telling the kids how to be good citizens. He wants the students, to learn to be good citizens by participating in their school. And the other quick note I'd make about John Dewey is he was a philosopher, by the way, very influenced in his own formation by German philosophy. I mean, he was a Hegelian to start, and one of his early books is called German Philosophy and Politics. So that's another link. But he was also a practitioner. He had a long life, and during that life, he built many institutions or helped to build them. So he left behind him the Laboratory School in Chicago and Teachers College in New York City and many other institutions. So, and he and his colleagues in that generation left a profound imprint on American education, not just through his ideas, but through his practice. So, on this slide also, there are two more faces. So I wanted to mention Jane Addams, actually literally my favorite American. Her autobiography is a wonderful book, and she had a long career and won the Nobel Prize in Peace late in her life. But the main thing she did was to move as a privileged and a woman with a high education, but little prospects for employment, along with her wife, basically, that's what we would call her life partner, to a poor neighborhood in Chicago to create a settlement house, which was a community-based learning environment. And so that is another tradition, the tradition of sort of learning in the community, adults learning outside of universities and schools. So she was actually a friend of John Dewey, and she discussed joining him at the University of Chicago, but she refused to because it was very important to her that Hull House was independent. And so there is that tradition of independent civic education for adults based in community. And that brings me to Dorothy Cotton, who's a participant in the American Civil Rights Movement. Her particular role was, at least for a time, she led the Citizenship education program, which was a program for teaching people who weren't literate in the conventional way, African Americans who had been denied education, couldn't read, to read in a democratic way. So for those who are familiar, very much like Paulo Freire, but before Paulo Freire. And she represents not only that tradition of popular education and democratic education outside of schools, but also the 200-year or 300-year long tradition of Black Americans doing democratic education despite not being offered that opportunity. So one more slide of this historical part, and then I know how I can conclude fairly concisely. So I wanted to mention Grundtvig, of course, a Danish thinker. And here I know about him mainly from my friend Tanya Klubert, who's on the call. So just as I shouldn't be talking about Dewey while Sarah's on the call, I shouldn't be talking about Grundtvig while Tanya's on the call. But I understand him to be, a great pioneer of the idea that popular education diffused through a whole country or several countries, because he worked in several Scandinavian countries, is a way of building up an excellent democratic culture. And so of course he's a inventor of folk schools and other approaches to popular education. So I mention him because there's a similarity between what he was doing and what Jane Addams was doing just a bit later in Chicago. I don't know for sure whether Addams was influenced by Grundtvig. I think that, by the way, I should say, I think Germans have been influenced by Grundtvig, but that's not my area of expertise. But this is why I brought him in, because he's influenced Americans. I mean, partly because of Scandinavian migration to America, which is very pronounced, but also because people read him. And so the bottom picture shows Miles Horton, the white man in the back, who was the founder of something called the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which played a very important role in the civil rights movement. So there he is with some of the people he worked with and helped to educate, but also learn from: Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, the folk musician Pete Seeger, Martin Luther King's close colleague, Ralph Abernathy, Miles Horton's own brother. The reason I showed the picture, though, is because he was explicitly influenced by those two figures above. He went and talked to Jane Addams and learned his art of education from her, but he also read Grundtvig and considered Highlander a folk school. It is, in fact, it still exists. And so that's another tradition. It's education linked to social movements, education in a social movement. Okay, so let me. And this was to say that we've had waves of explicit, federally mandated or federally supported public civic education that leave a certain interesting legacy. So in the 1930s, when unemployment was rife, the federal government not only gave working class young men the opportunity to do work, but they also built into the Civilian Conservation Corps a strong democratic curriculum, which, by the way, contrasts with the big public works programs in both the fascist and the communist worlds, because it was democratic. So it's a heritage to be proud of. In 1947, there was a very successful movement to dramatically expand universities in the United States, which led to, tripling or so the size of higher education. And there was, of course, a report calling for that, because governments produce reports. But what's interesting about that report is that it makes education for democracy the goal. Part of that is Cold War framing. It's anti-communist, but part of it is real. It was about trying to improve democracy by having better higher education. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s led to other service type programs, such as what I'm showing is a poster from the 1970s of a federal service program that still continues. So the other thing I would just mention is that both civilian and even military service have been opportunities for civic education in the American history. So lastly, how are we doing? So we have these two traditions of one is the Tocquevillian tradition of learn to be a good citizen by practicing citizenship in community. And the other is the Horace Mann tradition of learn to be a good citizen in school. So I want to say both of them are not very good conditions today. There are certainly good things that are going on and wonderful people trying to do their best, but these things are not going very well. So with regard to the Tocquevillian story, I think what happened is that in the 1900s, Americans built up a fairly robust set of associations across the US. They tended to be segregated, so they were typically associations that were mostly or overwhelmingly or exclusively white, and associations that were for African Americans, and men and women often associated differently. But most people associated. So my graph shows that in the 1970s, most Americans either went to a church generally or another religious congregation, or were active members of their union, or both. And most Americans read a daily newspaper every day. And those were three examples of civic associations that had been built up. It was some considerable work and struggle. I mean, there were attempts to certainly destroy them, but they were successful. What you see is today, those are minority activities. And I think what's happened is we have a robust civic life, but it consists of little independent associations with difficult financial models, drawing particularly interested people and not reaching millions. And then the last slide, I think I'll end with just quickly too. Most people don't think our civic education in schools is going very well. Now that's more complicated, I mean, because it's not always bad and because some of the measures are not so wonderful. So you might think that it's not as bad as it looks, but I'll just show you that, for example, there's a federal assessment of civic education knowledge. It's like a test, although it doesn't have an effect on the student's future. It's just a measurement. But it shows very poor scores. Those are very poor scores, and very flat scores. And so most people would think we're not doing a great job in school. But more to the point, the US is a deeply inequitable country with vast disparities between the advantaged and the disadvantaged. And basically people who come from advantaged backgrounds do pretty well on the civics tests, and people who come from poor backgrounds don't. And so what I'm showing here is the scores depending on whether your parents went to university and whether you are not poor, versus the bottom row is people who are poor and whose parents didn't go to university. And there's a gigantic disparity. And come to think of it, I didn't think of this, I should have shown a slide. It's been shown actually that the disparities are more severe in the United States than in any of the other developed democracies in terms of the civic education scores. So I'll just say I start with this sort of Tocquevillian and then Deweyan perspective, but I don't think that most people think we're doing a particularly good job in either way in the beginning of the 21st century. So let me stop sharing, and looking forward to discussing both today and later.
Great, thank you. That was a helpful input, I think, to put everything in context. And so now we'll hear from the German side of things. So I'm excited to get to introduce our second speaker, Bettina Heinrich. Bettina is a professor at the Protestant University of Applied Sciences, Ludwigsburg. She studied education and cultural studies and has worked in a variety of management positions at the intersections of cultural work and policy, education, as well as social work. She was deputy head of the Department of Cultural Affairs at the Berlin Senate Chancellery and subsequently director of the Wannsee Forum Foundation, which actually has an interesting German-American related history. And her teaching and research focuses on the intersection of culture, politics, and civil society movements, and the culture of how collaborative work process can be designed today in a multidisciplinary project landscape in the policy fields of culture, civic education, and social work. So I will let you take it away, Bettina.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Katja, for the kind introduction, and again, a warm welcome from my side, and thanks a lot for the also for the invitation. It's a real challenge for me to go through all the topics, you know, not in the title, civic learning versus politische Bildung in Germany, discussion of concepts, infrastructures, and approaches in Germany. But I promise I try my very best. And yes, I have 4 topics I want to focus on. First of all, I go more into the recent past of politische Jugendbildung than into the past, the far past. The first of all, it's the legal basis for politische Jugendbildung. So I try to really process it quite systematically. I take a quick look back to the history and East and West, and there was a question about the infrastructure. Seeing the German infrastructure from outside might be a sort of clutter, I don't know, or I really hope it becomes for you a sort of understandable system. And then I will finish with some developments and discussion on what matters in politische Bildung. But maybe we can proceed this or postpone this to the discussion later. And I think important is that I focus mainly on the extracurricular youth civil education and not on the formal education. So I'm already start with my first topic. The legal basis is quite easy. It is the Social Code Book 8, Child and Youth Services. And in section 11, there's written youth work is based on the principle of voluntariness, and it's very important from my point of view, is focusing on the interests of young people. In German, it's called Lebensweltorientierung, and I looked it up in Linguier, and they said life world orientation. For me, sorry, it sounds a little bit weird, but it's the translation. And key aspects of youth work include extracurricular political education, amongst others, and the international youth work. So it's quite clear, and the legal basis. So I just immediately jump to my quick look back. It's also in Germany a lot about democracy in the past and in recent times. I start I start with the late 1940s. Okay, civic or youth civic education started earlier, but I start with the late 40s, 1940s and 50s, because it's for Germany the most important area, and the re-education is, as you all know, is very much or is linked, or it's based on the work of the US and UK allies. And there's a quotation or a quote, what is the overall goal? And as you can see, I'm now in the former so-called Western part, or the former Federal Republic of Germany. To lead back Germany to the cultural community of civilized nations that it had left under the National Socialist regime. And then followed the first sort of institutionalization, consolidation, and discourse on politische Bildung, on civic education. And in 1952, the Federal Agency of German Education Organizations were founded. It's a federal public authority providing citizenship education and information on political issues. And all of you here in this room know the ADB. It's the Association of German Educational Organizations, founded in 1959. And I brought one example. So you already mentioned it, the Wannsee Forum, since I've been the former director, and somehow the Wannsee Forum stands a little bit past pro toto. It's founded in 1984 as Wannsee Center for Youth Work, and it was founded as a so-called Jugendleiterschule. It's a leadership training center, and it was specifically an initiative of the American military government. And the most important priority was to learn and to practice democracy. And as you, or later, or quite soon, in 1951, the High Commission for Occupied Germany decided to give back the administration to the institution, and independent body, the Wannsee Center for Youth Work, was founded. And this was 1951. And then they got a quite posh house, as you can see. And by the way, it's a water property, so it's really quite posh. And what is also very important, and what is very much linked to the history, is that one significant heritage of the early Anglo-American years was to combine civic and cultural education. And one result of the whole re-education program was, by the way, that there was a rather pluralistic and a lot of independent organization. now I just come quickly to the 60s and 70s because I think it's similar. There was a sort of big change and reclaiming more democracy. It's still about democracy in the West or in the former Federal Republic, more democracy and more participation. So there were new social movements, you know, and one quite famous pedagogue, he wanted to have more emancipatory education. And one example how this, you know, got a sort of, or got into a sort of real life was also in Wannsee Forum, 1975, when they started with the girl empowerment activities. And this was it was totally new. And okay, I added the former chancellor because in Germany it's a quite famous quote, we want to dare more democracy. So, and this was quite specific for the 60s and 70s, and it changed in the 90s. Okay, firstly, there came the reunification, and this was, as you know, a big historical step. And then in the 90s, late 80s, the socio-economic crisis with a rising unemployment rates and hence decreasing importance of politische Bildung, and last but not least, a lot of institutions were closed. And this development, I think, continued in the 2000s, mainly the neoliberal turn, because it was very much about competencies, and it was and is still very much about employability. And just a brief view to a quick glance on the GDR. There was founded a Free German Youth in 1946, and this was the only state youth organization in the GDR, and mainly in the early years, also that the Free German Youth focused on, you know, build up a kämpferische Demokratie. It's called, I don't know whether it's translated properly, to build up a fierce democracy. So either in East or in West, it was very much about democracy. The history is finished. Let's go to the infrastructure of politische Bildung. And I will quickly eliminate that topic, looking at non-formal and informal education. What is specific for Germany, that politische Jugendbildung, in the sense of youth civic education in a non-formal setting, is mostly provided by independent organizations, institutions, and associations, and funded by public money. And the money comes either from the federal government, German states. As you may know, in Germany there are 16 different states, and we have this kind of federal system, and the municipalities, or also the European Union. And last but not least, there are also a lot of institutions, from unions, churches, and organizations, and also political party foundations. And looking at the non-formal setting, the first question was who is funding, and the second question is who are the actors in that field. The actors are youth clubs, associations, as the Wannsee Forum, non-formal youth education centers, residential youth education centers with the possibility of overnight stay, as the Wannsee Forum. And what in Germany also is quite important as an educational site is the sites of historical remembrance. And in the field of adult education, Peter, you mentioned Grundtvig, is the Volkshochschule. the adult education centers. And now I just go briefly to the Politische Jugendbildung in an informal setting. It's also mostly provided by independent organizations, initiatives, and civil society organizations. And the whole German discussions is also very linked to Tocqueville, John Dewey, and the fields you opened. So these are youth organizations, local political initiatives that are arising quite a lot in Germany, minority rights initiatives, grassroots civic and socio-cultural initiatives. And also initiatives in the broad field of youth culture, I will come back to that, and social media. And furthermore, there are so-called youth voluntary services, and the whole participation issue is supported by so-called service points for youth participation. And last but not least, we have, besides the funding of the more or less of the infrastructure, we have specific funding programs, and we have, being honest, a lot of funding programs. Either from the EU, the federal state, and the German states. And here I only brought three. From the European Union, the Erasmus Plus program Youth. It's a European exchange program for young people and youth workers. And what is quite new is the program of the federal state, called Live Democracy. And as you can see, this program promotes democracy, shapes diversity, and prevents extremism. So, and we have similar programs on the state level. Here's only one example in the state of Rhineland-Pfalz. In the civic educators community, these programs are discussed very much because they are a sort of firefighting programs, and they, as you can see, focus mostly on specific topics or specific target groups. But I will come back to that point later. And yes, I'm already reached my last topic, developments and discussions, or what matters in politische Bildung. So I want to point out and emphasize three topics. First, again, the starting point, democracy matters, with some facts and figures. And secondly, I want to focus again on the question, or focus more on the diverse needs and interests of young people. What does it mean? And thirdly, I throw some snapshots on the German discussions. And this is not, it's without any claim to be to completeness. So, you know, these are snapshots and spotlights. It's not, there's not at all a claim to be complete. It's, as you can see, democracy matters still, and even a little bit more, because also in Germany, democracy has got a small dent or a conk. And even with this quite well-developed landscape of civic education institutions, as you know, we have similar problems with mistrust in democracy. But I come to the starting point, that democracy matters, some facts and figures. The Shell study, the 18th, with the title "A Generation Speaks Up," had or as you can see, the interest in politics of young people. Young people means here from 12 to 25. the interest of young people is generally increased within the last years, and slightly decreased from 2015 to 2019. And the second, it's quite good news, young people are convinced of the relevance of political engagement. And also this conviction is increasing. And second good news for me, it was somehow surprising, the satisfaction with democracy among young people is is surprisingly high. 77% of the young people between 12 and 25 are satisfied or very satisfied with democracy as a system, and only 20% are unsatisfied. But now there are coming the worrying news. The disenchantment with the politicians or with politics is on a high level, mainly the mistrust or being unsatisfied with the politicians. So what does it mean? 71% say politicians don't care what people like me think. That means 71% of young people don't feel to be heard, to be seen, to be represented by politicians. So they trust in the system, but they don't trust in the representatives. That democracy matters. You can, or another proof is that the 16th Child and Youth Report released last November focused on supporting democracy education for children and young people. And as you can see, it's quite ambitious. It has almost 700 pages. And the report goes really systematically through the whole education system and ends with policy recommendations. And also there is a statement of the federal government on supporting democracy education for children and young people. And now coming to the second,
Bettina,
from my point of view, yeah?
I do want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, yes, and it's here, back to the social...
They're already here. I knew that would happen.
Okay.
They come early.
Sorry about that.
Okay, the social code book 8 and youth work is focusing on the needs and interests of young people, these life world orientations. And here, thank you to Katja. I think it's a quite important statement of the director. He stated, no, we don't need more civic education. We need another civic education that is closer to the lived realities of the participants. And from my point of view, there are at the moment, or there are generally 3 areas of lived realities, amongst others for sure. And these are all settings for informal education. Firstly, youth culture. Secondly, the activism in the field of diversity, minority rights activism. And thirdly, activism in the field, in the local area. So youth civic engagement in the local area. I brought 3, to make it a little bit more to illustrate it, 3 slides. One slide for the youth culture, from hippies to hip hop, from pop to punk, from riot girls to ultras. And one quote, I'm the CEO of the label of Spring Stuff. Here I can release cool music and nevertheless doing education in the field of civic education. So here you can see this is a mission statement. Youth culture always means also a sort of political self-expression. Secondly, the civic engagement in the field of diversity. There's only one example, Young Voice, the youth organization of the Turkish community in Germany, and there are a lot of other from Sinti and Roma, people of color, LGBTIQ, and so on. So this is only one example to make it clearer. And a third one is activism, youth civic engagement in the local area. This is an initiative called Urban Liga. They are looking for Zukunftsschutzgebiete, so-called future protection areas. And this is the important question of these kind of youth civic groups. Who owns the city? And from my point of view, it's quite important to focus on these kind of lived realities and hence on the informal youth education sector, and to strengthen or to tighten the connections between non-formal and civic education, informal and informal learning. My last point, the snapshots, I think here it's societal change, so it's universal and it's not a real problem, it's a fact. And in Germany, we have this kind of very specific feature, the well-developed landscape, but we also have this kind of firefighting programs that are really criticized highly, and these general topics. And coming really to the end, the discussions on challenges and for politische Bildung, as I mentioned, the system is well developed, but the firefighting idea and always focusing prevention or special groups like migrants or disadvantaged is a big discussion point. And in our publicly funded system, there's also another question: are we dynamic enough? So I will stop here with a quote from an artist. This is a sort of political message from an artist, which is also important. The world is yours, but the world also is also ours, but basically yours. So thank you. Now I was a little bit quick, sorry.
No, it was a lot of information, and I think I imagine that there are questions and some ideas sparked. So we have a little bit of time to go through some questions from the audience. So please, if you just want to raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and we can get to those. I know that I have a question, and I think Bettina commented a bit on it, but well, actually, okay, let's go to Martin Kaiser.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. And I have a question for Peter Levine. And it's a bit about the differences. Could you please comment on two things? The first one is, you said American society is very well developed in association building. That goes to the structure of civil society. What kind of associations are you thinking of, and how are they important? To what extent are they important for civic education? And the second one relates to the methods and approaches. We heard from Bettina about non-formal education. Now, if you speak about non-formal education, what do you have in mind as an American person doing education? Because we think of this school system and formal education and the difference of informal, it's a difference of funding. But what do you have in mind when you hear that difference?
Great questions, thank you. One thing I would say is we have this tradition of associational life, but it is in decline. So I don't really know if at this moment it's very strong. But there are many kinds of associations, and pluralism is itself good. There should be many, but I think the core Tocquevillian idea is that association is self-governing. So it's a group in which people play the roles of managing the group. And so the classic kind of American association is one where people get together and elect one of themselves president and one of themselves treasurer and one of themselves secretary and have a meeting. And so that's the civic, that's what Tocqueville thought was the civic education. Partly because when you do that, you then also see how the United States Congress should work, because you have experienced self-governing at that level. So you can understand what to expect from politicians. And maybe that I can be brief and say that's also what I meant. So I think the phrase informal education is less common in the US, but the way I would answer your second question is, it's actually participation in self-governing groups at all levels. They can be in the state sector because the governmental agency can decentralize power so that it's self-governing, but very often they're voluntary nonprofits.
Great. Emma Humphreys.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed both presentations and I learned a lot. So it seems to me that over the past 5 decades, civic ed in the US has been in decline, but we hope experiencing a resurgence. I'm trying to figure out how I would characterize the past 5 decades of civic education in Germany. And it seems to me, based on Bettina's presentation, that it's been stable and sufficient, if not quite strong. Is that how folks would characterize that? Does that seem correct?
Bettina, do you want to?
Yeah.
Or anyone else want to chime in?
Pardon, Katja?
I said, Bettina, would you want to answer that? And then feel free if anyone else has opinions that they want to chime in.
Anyone from or everyone from can join. Yeah, okay. There was a decline of institutions. So we have I think it's not a specific development, but the civic education institution declined from, I think, 500 something in the 70s to, I don't know, 200 something. So this was a real decline. But on the other hand, looking at civil society as organizations, especially in Germany, for example, the Vereine, what is, I think, in the States, the 501c3 organizations. And so we had an enormous increase of activities of this kind of Vereine, and also mainly in the field of education. And by 1990, we had, there were founded, of the whole organizations, we have 33%, and since 1990, within the last 25 years, another 66%. So this is a different development. So,
Susanna Drake, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm from Willy Eichler Academy in Cologne, but I'm seated in Brussels. And what we witness both in Germany everywhere and also here in Belgium is that the constituencies we are able to reach have changed. And this is something that is, I think, very much comparable to the situation in the United States. That means that people who are from bildungsfern, as we say, further away from education background, and people who have a background in migration or who are refugees and who have in general a lot of financial problems are also less likely to engage in associations and to participate in non-formal political education. And that is something where we as organizers of non-formal education have really to focus on how to reach people who have not finished secondary education, who have not the means to speak different languages, and who use the internet in a very haphazard way. So I think that this is really a focus which is a challenge for both our societies at the moment.
Navina, you're muted.
So, I think you always have to keep in mind that Germany still exists out of 2 parts, and that we have 16 states. I mean, we are like two parts, because I think for myself, you can't actually compare East and West Germany. They are different, let's say, structures and cultures. So that is what I think, my idea, but other people may have other opinions. And then you always have to think that we are 16 states and that the condition maybe in Lower Saxony, which is up in the north, is quite different to the situation maybe in Bavaria. So for example, in Lower Saxony, they cut a lot of money, and after the last or even before the election of the state, they cut a lot of money, and now they're rebuilding these structures. So I think that's something quite typical for Germany, that you have these structures in different states, different fundings.
Niels, do you want to make a quick comment, and then I'll hand it back for one final wrap up?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. We have the differences, but from my point of view, I think the difference go also between North and South of Germany, or different regions within East and not only East and West. Looking at Hunsrück, for example, it's a quite rural region. It's quite a poor region, or looking to the former so-called Ruhrgebiet, and you know where really that was hit by a socio-economic transformation process. And we have also regions in Eastern Germany. They are now a little bit better off, and so I think it's not only East-West. We have different regions, and it's a big discussion in German that there is this kind of also injustice between the regions, you know. And for example, what I mentioned, Hunsrück, the region in Rheinland-Pfalz, or some Ida-Oberstein. So these are little villages or cities, not villages, that lost about almost half of their inhabitants, similar to East Germany. So.
Peter, before we close out, I know we're right up on time, but Emma had mentioned a bit about some new energy in the US around civics education. So I'd love to just hear what you think, where is that coming from, and what's happening with it? Where are we going from here? What are you hopeful for?
I think Emma and I would both like everyone to look at Educating for American Democracy website, because we both were working on that project, and it is a recent contribution. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concern about the state of American democracy, shared with other developed countries, but in some ways acute, particularly the polarization question, the fact that Americans really hate each other around political differences, and in, I think, new ways, is worrying people. And so people are looking to civic education. So I would actually say two things: polarization and propaganda and the internet are two things that are alarming a lot of Americans. And for both things, civic education feels like a response. And so it's getting more attention than it has.
Great. Well, we certainly have more to talk about. I feel like we barely scratched the surface. I have myself, I was putting together some things that I wanted to ask about, and it was so hard to narrow it down. So thank you to Peter and Bettina, both of you, so much for being here and giving us some insights that kind of put us on the same playing field and allow us to have this conversation in a more productive way. And luckily, we have a year to continue having this conversation. So I hope that you all consider applying for the TECE fellowship, or pass that along to others you think might be interested, and stay engaged. We'll have some open events that we hope that you all will be involved in. And I, again, will pop in the chat my email. Feel free to contact me, and somewhere where you can sign up to stay in contact. So thank you again so much for being here. And we will actually, a few of us are going to be staying on at this point to answer questions specifically about the TECE program and the fellowship application process. So if you're interested in that portion, feel free to just hang out with us in this room. Otherwise, I hope you have a great evening, a great afternoon, a great morning, whatever it may be. So thank you again.